You're listening to the Valley Current.
Okay, wow, teachers. Is that like a water pistol? Librarians. Oh, arming school staff. Okay, that's good. Let's put it up on the screen because it's so funny. Arming school staff.
Yes.
Teachers get the full gun and the librarians get the silencer.
Correct.
That's good. That's funny. Gosh, that's pretty funny. Yeah, I guess that was the Trump thought that maybe the right approach is to have the school staff be armed. Yeah, I guess there's still a view about that. If we arm enough people and
send it to all of your conservative Trump people.
You know, the thing that we could talk about, but I wanted to focus on this. I wanted to focus on this latest stuff in India because we predicted a few.
One question, however, I'm puzzled. Unless you have a fake background, are you back in the Bay Area?
No, I got a fake background.
Okay.
I could use something else like this, which of course always brings me a chuckle because I've got a number of different backgrounds stored. That's my yoga pose showing that I reached a certain point of flexibility, right? It's kind of a statement. And then of course I've got a background that shows how this stuff gets published as a podcast by Apple and others. And we've gotten some really good reviews from people because you're such a great authority on viruses and vaccines. And that's kind of the topic of today, which is we're getting these reports from India, which really were something you and I were talking about, whether there would be a second phase or a second wave. And we all thought, yeah, if you looked at the curve from the 1918 timeframe, it looked like there was a second wave that was even larger than the first. And it does look like the second wave in India is larger than the first wave in India. And I wonder whether we're going to see a bit of a repetition of that to some degree in other countries, because you did predict that vaccines wouldn't necessarily make their distribution in a totally equitable fashion, which of course turns out to be true because we're still dealing with the politics of the planet. And it looks like India is suffering to a great degree. I would have thought Brazil would have suffered first, but like this was something that you and I had talked about, and we looked at some of these graphs, and I'll put them up just to refresh your memory of it. We did these graphs. We looked at these graphs that are readily available now online. There's a lot of them that basically show what that second wave looked like in 1918, and it kind of looked a little bit like this. There's a bunch of them here, but there's a sort of a second bump in the data, according to the way these various.
Is that curve for China or the world?
I guess it's the world. I don't know. It's a good question, right? Because this is 1918 data. I assume they're showing it from a period from June. I mean, the one that I have up in blue right now is showing it for the period from June of 1918 until about June of 1919. And it really almost looks like three waves, a small wave first, then a much bigger wave, and then a much smaller wave.
Yeah, well, it's no surprise that that's going on in India and in Brazil and in other countries. It is still a possibility in this country if the mutations or what people are trying to dress up the word and make it sound a little less important, calling it variants, but they're mutations. But if the mutations that exist now, there are 6 of them that are that are active. They were just described this morning by Tony Fauci. If they get loose in this country, one of them is here now, but it's thankfully covered by the present vaccines. But if others arrive here and become able to escape the neutralizing antibodies produced by the present vaccines in this country, then we could have a very serious problem and another increase in coronavirus cases in this country that could be a serious surge.
Right. I mean, people are saying that there are people that are coming into the United States from Brazil. And I would think at some level, we should be worried about people that may be infected in Brazil or, for example, in India, coming in and then reinfecting the US population, which is not totally vaccinated. The last I heard was that about a third of the US population has been vaccinated, and about 40 or so percent have gotten at least one shot. And I guess there's a large number of people not getting the second shot because there's sort of folklore and anecdotal information that the second shot kind of can result in a reaction. And of course, you've deferred, if I remember your statement, you're deferring getting any vaccination until maybe the end of the year, right?
Well, actually, I got my first shot of the Pfizer vaccine yesterday.
Okay, so how do you feel?
I feel fine. I have a trivial tenderness at the site of inoculation, but it's only felt when I press on it.
Right.
With my right hand. So,
right. I had no reaction to the first Pfizer shot, but the second Pfizer shot, within about 6 or 12 hours, I really felt very faint. And the next day or the next evening or that evening, I slept for like 14 hours. And I felt like it really knocked me out for a couple of days. I mean, I was able to get up and get to a computer and do some work, but I really felt like, man, that second shot really was quite a jolt. The first shot, no problem at all.
Yeah, that's not uncommon.
And I guess it's causing some people not to get the second shot, right?
Perhaps I will get the second shot regardless of that possibility, but I decided to do it because most of the mutations are adequately covered by the present vaccine, but I'm not at all dismissing the likelihood that as these mutations begin to circulate and more become serious consideration and likely not to be covered by the vaccine I presently took, that there will have to be another round of vaccines produced to cover the variants.
Right. It almost seems like we may be in a mode where there'll be an annual vaccine, not unlike what people have done annually for the flu.
I anticipated that, I think, when I told you that it could mimic the present situation with the influenza virus,
right,
where annual vaccinations are necessary.
Right.
So that's certainly a possibility, if not a probability.
Right. And so when you think about sort of what happened in India, would you say it's a combination of sort of poor, I don't know if I want to call it poor hygiene, but poor social distancing, poor mask usage, lots of density, lots of maybe, hey, why worry? And then just no ability to get the vaccines in place fast enough? Or would you say there's something else that explains why India in particular is getting hit so hard, I guess to a similar extent Brazil?
Well, it's a combination of variables. The first one is that Modi, the prime minister, was very casual about the arrival of the virus in India and in fact allowed for several celebrations of massed thousands of people in one place, and other celebrations where people were found to be massed in their tens and hundreds of thousands, which is very common in India. In addition to that, the living conditions of a substantial portion of the India population live in very crowded conditions, multi-family circumstances. And if anything, I don't know whether this factor is also happening, a factor that was discovered by Alex Comfort 50 years ago when he made a trip to India to try to answer the question, why does Alzheimer's disease not exist in India?
Uh-huh.
And what he discovered was the answer, which was that the occurrence of Alzheimer's disease and probably other diseases and pathologies in India is a serious embarrassment to the remaining family of the victim, so that the family will shelter the victim, hide the victim somewhere in the house, and prevent that fact from being known to outsiders or to other family members or friends. So that the fact that it doesn't exist, as Alex found, is because it was hidden from the authorities.
Right.
The victims were taken care of. They weren't not cared for. But the fact that they existed was hidden. And
Right.
That's why Alzheimer's disease didn't exist in India. Now, if that cultural situation exists for the COVID virus and its victims, then you have another reason to believe why this surge has occurred, because it has reached such proportions that it now cannot be hidden. And there's lots of evidence for that in respect to the number of graves being dug, and the failure to have enough emergency room treatment available and oxygen available. So the overpopulation in India, 1.2 billion people in a country, I think, that's smaller than the United States geographically, or perhaps the same size. But this is an indication of overpopulation and what can happen when a virulent virus gets loose in that population.
Right. So when you think about it, do you say to yourself that Modi really must feel very guilty right now as someone who sort of jumped the gun in the way, in many ways, Trump did the same thing during the election cycle. And I think he did cause some super spreader events to occur, although he didn't really get charged with any sort of crime or any real shamefulness from it. But do you think Modi at this point must be getting shamed? Maybe he'll get shamed right out of office, right? But I think the people in India like him a lot, right?
Well, if he feels shame, he's got more humanity in his soul than many of the Trumpers and their supporters and the Republican governors who took no means or trivial means to protect the citizens of their states from this pandemic. And I don't think any of them have expressed any feelings of regret whatsoever. This is very difficult to understand, but of course, politically, for the governors of those states to now express publicly their regret is political suicide. So they're not going to do it, despite the fact that they may actually feel it. But this is an example of the incredible behavior of right-wing Republican zealots who apparently have no souls when it comes to understanding the virulence of microorganisms.
Right. It's almost like because you can't see it, it changes your view about the risk, right? It's almost at that level. It's like if you could see an infestation of wasps or bees or even ants, you get the sense that, hey, there's stuff going on here that may not be.
Well, you get the sense that these reactionaries are living in the 17th century before the germ theory was developed. If they don't believe the germ theory today, then there's no hope for these people.
Yeah, I mean, at some level, I guess they're getting a big lesson here with a lot of huge consequences, because the radio shows that I've heard sound like the crematoriums are unable to deal with the volume of deceased bodies, which I guess are mostly cremated, and there's just not enough.
Well, it's similar to what we all observed in New York City at the outset of the pandemic there, when 18-wheelers were lined up outside of hospitals, refrigerated 18-wheelers, to accept the deceased from COVID-19, which is analogous to what's happening in India now. Instead of using 18-wheelers, they're burying them because they have the means to do it, which we didn't have in New York City at that time. So there are parallels worldwide.
Right.
The state of denial is such a tragedy. It just represents a level of ignorance that's hard for people with more than 2 neurons to understand.
Well, at some level, what would you say would need to happen almost instantly in India if you could pass a magic wand? I don't know, there are no magic wands in this area. And obviously, India has its supporters and it has its detractors. And certainly the United States has been a big supporter of India. And it does look like some support is being provided. But I wonder what you would say in general if you were trying to give Modi some advice. What would you tell him would instantly have to occur? It almost seems like you have to shut down all activities that have people congregating in any way, including, of course, getting on the train system there, which often is very packed. If you've ever been to Mumbai or Delhi, the train system is used kind of in a very dense way, and people do, move around the city using a very congested mass transportation system, including trains and buses.
I don't think there's any short-term solution to the current pandemic in India. Any actions that are implemented today will not have any positive consequences for probably several months down the road, during which time this pandemic is going to kill maybe millions of people in India. And the things that have to be done are as follows. First of all, India has one of the world's biggest vaccine manufacturing plants in existence in that country, which was actually making some of the vaccines currently in use out of India. So they will have to stop exporting vaccines being made in that huge facility and start delivering it only within the country. The second thing that they have to do, which is virtually impossible there, is to educate people to wear masks universally. We can't even do it in this country, let alone in India. So that the outlook is really grave, in not only in India, but it also should be encouraged for nations surrounding India to implement the same anti-COVID-19 practices that we're doing in this country: vaccination, mask wearing, social distancing. The latter, of course, is almost impossible to do in countries of overpopulation that exist in the neighboring countries of India. So we could be looking at one of the world's most serious problems in respect to this outbreak of COVID-19 in that part of the world, so that its spread in the dimensions that exist in India have a very strong likelihood of occurring in Pakistan and China and in other neighboring countries.
So when you look at what a world response would be to this, how does a organization like the World Health Organization end up looking at India versus Brazil versus some of the other hotspots around the world? It's got to be a tough choice to say, well, where do you decide to put resources? Of course, there's a number of other things going on in the world besides just this pandemic, but clearly this pandemic is, causing real death to happen in a big way, in a big and increasing way. And you're suggesting maybe it's even increased far larger because of the bias and shame that people have of even admitting to what may be going on in their households. And I know the NPR show went and tried to get a statement from one of the health officers in India, and she said, I can't give it to you right now because my state of mind is so confused by all the relatives which I have who are dying that I don't feel as though I can give an objective statement. But she did authorize that kind of quote. I thought it was quite a telling way to get the point across.
Well, if my experiences as a WHO advisor, which I was for several years, if the WHO is the same today in respect to its organization as it was then there's very little hope, because the World Health Organization is a highly politicized organization. The key positions in the organizations are traditionally handed off to individuals of the country in which the previous occupant of that position was a national. So there's very little turnover in respect to the national of the key players at WHO. Furthermore, WHO can only act in an advisory capacity. It has absolutely no authority to demand and in some way ensure that any country does what it suggests. So it's simply an advisor to countries. I sat at WHO rooms writing suggested regulations for the production of human virus vaccines for several years. And that's all they were. They were suggestions, mainly suggestions drawn from the experiences of the well-developed countries to be delivered to the lesser developed countries of the world. And it was all in the form of suggestions, because the WHO can't go beyond that. So despite the name World Health Organization, they have little, if any, power. They only have the power of suggestion and advice. And obviously, many countries are unwilling to accept even their own experts' advice, let alone that of foreigners. So I'm very pessimistic about what role they have played and could play. The only thing they did was to advise the world at one point in the epidemic that it was now to be called a pandemic.
Yes. So when you think about it, is that sort of cause to suggest that we really need kind of a complete revamping? Like, the one good thing that should come out of this is a recognition that there needs to be a complete revamping of one form or another of the World Health Organization, or is that just too much to imagine or ask?
One possibility is for them to obtain some kind of agreement with the rest of the world who they represent to establish some kind of body that really could mandate rules and regulations when it comes specifically to pandemics. But that's like getting the United Nations to agree on something, which is a rarity. So that what they need is what we had in this country, and which was destroyed by the Trump administration, and hopefully will be revived very soon by Biden administration. And that is a group of experts who are specifically directed to form rules and regulations for an upcoming epidemic that may arise in the future, and to have everything set in place, at least on paper, ready to be implemented, of what things have to be done, like the initiation of research to develop a vaccine for whatever is happening, and on and on and on. In other words, be prepared. And hopefully that organization that was dumped by the Trump administration will be reinactivated if it hasn't already been reinactivated. It's not very high on the priority of news reporters, so it may have already been done. I'm just not aware of whether it has been done yet.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like one of these things that you would think that the one thing that comes out of the pandemic and what might be this second wave pandemic or super pandemic or superdemic, if that's a word, is a suggestion that we need to completely revamp globally how we think of global health. And it's almost like if we don't do it, we can be sure that there will not be an appropriate response when this reoccurs, and it seems inevitable that it probably will reoccur, right?
Well, of course, and there have been many examples of it. The 1918 pandemic, there were many prior to that time. The word pandemic was not invented last year. It has been in our vocabulary for decades, if not centuries. So the concept of a worldwide outbreak of some uncontrolled microorganism, that concept is not new. It has been known and has been given a label, but the activity of the world in efforts to be prepared for a pandemic have been seriously lacking. They have never existed, to the best of my knowledge.
But we didn't learn from 1918 to 100 years later. You might say that's the best evidence that we probably won't learn for a number of years or 100 years.
Yes, well, there are other epidemics. Take malaria as an example. Malaria, I believe it's still true, is the biggest killer of any other source on the planet.
Right.
The tens of millions, I believe, are the numbers annually of people who die from malaria. So if you want to, that's not technically a pandemic because it doesn't occur in countries where the mosquito that carries the plasmodia don't exist. So it's technically not a pandemic, but it occurs in hundreds of, or I should say tens of other countries, and is a real killer. There is evidence very recently that a vaccine being developed, and there have been many attempts over the decades, but the one that I'm hearing about now has, in a trial, been reasonably successful, I think. 60 or 70% efficacy. So there's some hope on that front. But as far as the world being prepared for an epidemic, for a pandemic, that's did not occur in the past and is very unlikely to happen in the future, in my judgment. I'm very pessimistic about the world getting together to do anything that makes sense. And the examples are numerous. You only have to look to the behavior of the United Nations for the evidence.
It must be an interesting time right now for Tony Fauci to think about how he would revamp this stuff, but I'm wondering whether he's even going to be given any role in making any of those recommendations, and maybe he doesn't want to be given a role in doing so, right?
Well, I'm surprised how well Tony has done during this entire period. He has risen to the occasion. We all know, or should know, the leading authority on this virus and the leading Center for Accurate Messaging about this virus and its behavior and its treatment and public health policies.
Stay tuned for part 2 of this episode of The Valley Current.